He prayed 3 times. 3 times. Not once in a moment of weakness, not twice out of desperation. 3 times, deliberately, from a posture of faith and theology and a deep relationship with God. And the answer was no. Think about that. Think about who you are picturing right now. You're probably imagining someone you know, maybe someone who prays quietly in the dark. Maybe yourself at some point in the last year or the last decade, with some version of the same request you keep bringing to the same God who keeps not answering the way you need. We have been trained by the culture, by the church, by the architecture of every testimony we've ever heard to believe that the absence of the answer is always temporary, that the no is a not yet, that if your faith is real enough, if your surrender is complete enough, if your prayer is sincere enough, the breakthrough is a matter of timing, not possibility. But what if that framework is the very thing rotting your spiritual life from the inside? What if the most spiritually decisive moment of your life isn't the prayer God said yes to? What if it's the one He said no to, permanently, on purpose, with full knowledge of what that refusal would cost you? What if the no wasn't a failure of your faith? What if the no was the point? The no wasn't a failure of your faith. The no was the point. It is an accusation against everything we've been taught. There's a version of Christianity being sold right now, on platforms, from stages, through speakers and streams and curated highlight reels that has made a quiet, devastating trade. It has traded the cross for a promise of comfort. It has taken the gospel of a crucified God and turned it into a self-optimization program with Bible verses in the margins. And the machinery of it is precise. Every sermon arc bends toward the turnaround. Every testimony is curated for the moment the sickness lifted, the marriage healed, the prodigal came home. The worship songs build and build toward the emotional release of victory. The language, claim your healing, press through to your breakthrough, don't let go of your promise. All of it implies the same operational theology. Suffering is a temporary state that obedient faith will eventually exit. Which means the person who hasn't exited is the problem. This is the shame that doesn't get named from the pulpit, because naming it would break the whole economy of the performance. The person sitting with a chronic illness has been prayed over for 7 years. The mother who has stood in the altar line and spoken healing over her child's mind and gone home to watch the same darkness come back. The man who has confessed, surrendered, sought counseling, fasted, and still cannot get under the weight of his own depression. They are not just suffering. They are suffering while being told their suffering is a spiritual audit gone wrong. That is a specific, precise, grinding shame, and it operates quietly. It turns inward. It doesn't usually announce itself as a crisis of faith. It just makes the person a little quieter in the worship service, a little slower to raise their hand in prayer. It makes them start to believe, without ever saying it directly, that they are a category of believers that the promises don't quite apply to, that there is a gap between the Christianity being described and the one they are actually living, and the gap is their fault. The Instagram testimony culture amplifies this. You see the before and after. You see the diagnosis followed by the miraculous clean scan. You don't see the person whose scan came back the same for the 4th time, sitting in their car in the hospital parking lot, not sure if they can keep doing this. That person is watching this. That person needs more than a silver lining. They need someone to tell them the actual truth about what this passage says before telling them what it means. The man who prayed 3 times was Paul, not a new believer testing out prayer for the first time, not someone with a fragile, untested faith. Paul, the man who wrote half the New Testament, the man who planted churches across the Roman world, who had been caught up to the 3rd heaven, who had seen things he wasn't permitted to describe. This is the man filing the same request 3 times and receiving a no. But you have to understand the context of the room Paul is writing in when he tells this story in 2 Corinthians. Because he is not writing from a place of serene theological reflection. He is in a war. The Corinthian church is being actively seduced. A group of traveling preachers, scholars call them the super apostles, have moved in and are selling a version of Christianity that looks like power. eloquence, signs and wonders, uninterrupted success, the kind of Christianity that photographs well. And Paul, by contrast, is a man who has been beaten with rods 3 times, shipwrecked 3 times, stoned once, left for dead, imprisoned, hungry, and marked by suffering in ways that his opponents are using against him. In their framework, his weakness is the evidence that he's not the real thing. So, Paul writes back, and his entire defense for his apostleship is not his credentials, it's not his miracles, it's his suffering and his unanswered prayer. That is the move he makes. That is an almost insane rhetorical choice in the Roman honor culture. In a world where weakness was proof of divine disfavor, Paul looks at his weakness and says, "This is my credential. This is where Christ is most visible in me." Then he tells them about the thorn. The thorn in the flesh. And here is where you need to sit in honest discomfort with the text, because we do not know what it was. Scholars have spent centuries proposing options: chronic eye disease, epilepsy, a speech impediment, persistent spiritual opposition, a specific enemy who kept undermining his ministry. The text doesn't say, and that ambiguity is not a gap in the record. It is a deliberate theological design. If Paul had named the thorn, we would have domesticated this passage into one category of suffering. It would be a text for people with physical illness or people with a specific relational wound, and everyone else would quietly conclude it doesn't apply to them. God left the thorn unnamed so that no one could opt out. The thorn is your thing, the specific, stubborn, recurring thing that you have asked God to remove, and He has it. The passage was written for exactly that thing, whatever it is, because the thorn was always meant to be a template, not a specific case study. Let that detonate slowly. The most popular reading of this passage is also the most spiritually neutered one, and we need to name it directly before we can see what the text is actually doing. The comfortable version goes like this: God sometimes allows us to go through hard things so that we can eventually grow stronger. And one day, when we've learned the lesson, the hard thing will be removed, and we'll look back and understand why it was necessary. The suffering is the tunnel. The healing is the destination. God's goodness is proven when He takes the thorn away, or at least when He takes it away eventually. That reading is not in this text. We have collapsed the God of the universe into a cosmic mechanic, a divine customer service system where the resolution of your ticket is the proof of His competence. We treat the thorn like a glitch in a program that a loving God is obligated to patch once we input the correct combination of faith and surrender and correct theology. And when the patch doesn't come, we assume the fault is ours. Wrong passcode, insufficient faith, unconfessed sins somewhere in the code. But that requires ignoring what Paul actually writes. Paul prayed 3 times for removal. 3 specific, intentional, faith-filled requests. Not once in a moment of panic. 3 times, which in Paul's Hebraic framework was a complete, sufficient petition. And God didn't say the removal is coming. God didn't say keep pressing, your breakthrough is close. God gave him a present tense statement about permanent reality. My grace is sufficient for you. Not will be sufficient, not was sufficient in the past and proof it will be sufficient again, is. Present tense, ongoing, now. The surface reading turns grace into a bridge, a temporary support structure you live on until you get to the other side, where the problem no longer exists. The actual text makes grace the permanent address. The destination is not the absence of the thorn. The destination is the sufficiency of grace, experienced inside and through and alongside the thorn, which is still there. You have to feel that difference somewhere deeper than your theology. One is a coping mechanism waiting to become obsolete. The other is a complete restructuring of what you thought you were asking for when you brought your request to God. Paul does not say he accepted the thorn. Read the passage again. He says he boasts in his weaknesses. That word matters enormously, and most readings of this text slide right past it, like it's interchangeable with acceptance or endurance or making peace with something. It is not the same thing. Acceptance is the grinding, teeth-clenched decision to continue living with something you hate. Acceptance is noble. Acceptance is hard, but it is fundamentally passive. It is the posture of a person who has lowered their expectations and learned to function at a lower altitude. Boasting is something violently different. In Paul's world, Roman honor culture, where your public reputation was your most valuable asset, where weakness and suffering were read by everyone around you as signs of divine disfavor or personal failure, to boast publicly in your weakness was not a spiritual virtue. It was a theological bomb going off inside the entire value system of his culture. It was Paul standing up in the room and saying, "The very thing you are using to disqualify me is the thing I am most proud of, because it is the thing that makes the source of my power undeniable." That is the deeper engine of this text. The divine purpose of the unanswered prayer is not to remove the weakness and replace it with strength. It is to reveal that the power of Christ operates most visibly, most undeniably, through exactly the thing you most want taken away. Think about why that would be the design. Because when the weakness stays and the ministry still happens, when the chronic pain persists and the love still flows from that person anyway, when the thorn is still in the flesh and the grace is still operating and the work is still being done, there is no other explanation available. You cannot attribute it to the person's natural resilience. You cannot attribute it to their wellness, their healing, or their breakthrough moment. The weakness strips away every alternative explanation, and what's left is only God. The unanswered prayer is God's most aggressive act of self-revelation in your life. Not despite the suffering remaining, because it remains. The thing you have been begging Him to take from you may be the thing He is using most visibly to prove He is real. The healing you are begging for might be the exact thing that would destroy you. Not because God is cruel, not because the suffering is good in itself, but because the version of you that would exist after the thorn was removed, on your timeline, in response to your persistent petition, might be a version of you who no longer needs to lean on God in the same way. A version of you whose self-sufficiency would quietly, slowly rot everything that matters about your spiritual life. God is not withholding punishment from you. He is keeping the thorn in place as a localized, painful, ongoing chemotherapy targeting the terminal cancer of your independence. The no is not abandonment. The no is violent mercy. Now, this is not a guilt trip. I am not telling you that your desire for relief is a sin. The desire for the thorn to be removed is not evidence of weak faith. Paul had it. Paul prayed it 3 times. The desire is human and appropriate, and God doesn't rebuke it. But the theology underneath a lot of our petition lives in a transactional space that this text fundamentally cannot support. The transaction is, I bring the broken thing, God fixes the broken thing, I testify about the fixed thing, and the cycle proves the relationship is working. The thorn passage introduces a category of experience that the transactional model has no category for. The purposeful, grace-sustained, permanent wound that proves the relationship is working precisely because the thing has not been fixed. And then there is this, which is the hardest implication and the one most people will resist. What you have been calling an unanswered prayer, God may have already answered completely. My grace is sufficient for you. That is an answer. It is a full, direct, specific, theological answer to the prayer Paul prayed. The problem is not that God was silent. The problem is that the answer arrived in a language we hadn't budgeted for. And so we keep filing the same request, treating the answered one as if it were still pending. Is it possible, genuinely, uncomfortably possible, that you have been so focused on what God hasn't done that you have been unable to receive what God is actually doing right now inside the no? Don't answer that quickly. Let it be a real question. Look at the woman hiding in the church bathroom. There's a woman who has become an expert at the church bathroom. She knows exactly when to slip out between the bridge and the final chorus, when the sanctuary is loud enough that no one will notice. She sits in the stall, not crying exactly, just breathing, listening to the muffled bass through the drywall, running the same calculation she runs every Sunday. Everyone else in that room seems to be having an experience of God that she can't access. She has prayed, she has repented, she has done the work, and her mind still screams at her in the quiet. The diagnosis is still the diagnosis, and she doesn't know anymore whether the problem is God or herself. But the suspicion that it might be herself is becoming harder to put down. Then there's the worship leader who led 500 people into something real last Sunday. He knows it was real because he felt it too. And now it's 3 in the morning on Tuesday, and he is staring at the ceiling of a room where the lights are off, and the faith feels like a language he used to speak fluently and can't quite locate anymore. The lyrics he sang are sitting in the room with him like evidence. He is not sure he believes them the same way he did when he was singing them, and the gap between the Sunday version and the Tuesday version of himself is getting harder to explain away. There is someone who stopped praying. Not dramatically, not with a declaration or a crisis moment. They just quietly, over months, stopped filing the requests that kept coming back unanswered. Because after the 3rd year, the 5th year, the repeated no became a wall that felt more like evidence than absence. Evidence that they were not the kind of person whose prayers move things. And they are still in the church, still going through the motions, but the intimacy is gone, replaced by a kind of numb, functional attendance. For all 3 of those people, this passage is not offering a silver lining. It is not offering a reason to feel better about the hard thing. It is offering something that requires more from them than comfort would require. A completely different map. The destination was never the removal of the thorn. The destination was union with a God who was undeniably present inside the refusal. The life you prayed for is gone. Grace only lands when you stop pretending otherwise. There is a particular kind of surrender that nobody talks about. Not the triumphant surrender, not the ultra moment where the breakthrough comes right after you finally let go. That version has been described beautifully and repeatedly, and it is real and it matters. But there is another kind, the surrender that happens in the quiet, when the thorn is still there and the grace has still shown up. And you sit with both of those things at the same time without needing to resolve the tension between them. The surrender that does not pretend the pain is over, that does not perform acceptance it doesn't feel, that simply chooses to remain in the presence of the God who said no, because his presence is the answer, even if it is not the answer that was requested. Consider this. What if the prayer didn't need to change the circumstance to be answered? What if "my grace is sufficient for you" was not a placeholder until the real answer arrived? What if it were God pulling you closer, not pushing the problem away, and the closeness was always the point? Being held is not the same as being fixed. And there is a kind of healing that does not show up on any scan, that does not remove the thorn, that is not visible to anyone watching your life from the outside, that is nevertheless the most real thing that has ever happened to you. Stay in this, not in the noise of the request, in the presence of the one who answered. This week, pray the prayer you stopped praying. Not because the answer has changed. Pray it because honesty with God is always worth more than the silence that grows up around our disappointment. And at the end of it, add one sentence you have never added before. God, if the answer is still no, show me what you are doing inside the no. That is not resignation. That is the most courageous prayer available to you. The thorn was never the evidence that God had abandoned Paul. It was the evidence that God trusted him with something only grace could carry.